In this lecture, we're going to be discussing Buddhist Dharma and philosophy. And what's interesting is that the Buddha really didn't have much interest in discussing certain introspective philosophical questions. He found that these were just kind of distractions to the main issue, which is, again, trying to find that path to nirvana. And there are a lot of examples that are found in Buddhist texts that have these exchanges between the monks during this time, excuse me, and the Buddha to help resolve certain questions, some of these philosophical questions that have been plaguing humanity since, time began. Certain questions like, was the world created or is it eternal? Is the world finite or infinite? What is the relationship between the body and the soul or the self? Are they the same or are they different? What happens to you when you die? What happens to you when you reach enlightenment? Now, the Buddha would always try to skirt away from a lot of these questions, not because he didn't know, maybe he didn't know, but he felt that these were still distracting from the main point, which was how to find enlightenment. He used this metaphor to usually discuss some of these type of questions. He said, well, if a man was wounded by a poisoned arrow and said to his people that were around him, I will not have this arrow removed until I found out who exactly shot that arrow. What type of bow did they use? Where was he from? What kind of string was on that bow? And what kind of arrow was used to shoot that? And what type of poison that was? By that point, the man would die. And so all these questions would be useless in the grand scheme of things. So the Buddha's point is, look, some of these questions are important, but not necessarily important for your pursuit to finding enlightenment. So as you see here, if one focuses on such questions, they will never have the time to pursue the practices that can lead to nirvana. And that some of these questions need to remain unanswered. It's okay to have some of these questions unanswered, and that the focus should rather be on matters that tend to aversion, absence of passion, cessation, quiescence, knowledge, supreme wisdom, and nirvana. Now, with that said, however, there are some important concepts that the Buddha does discuss that are related to various Indian philosophies that were popular during that time and continue to be popular today. The first of which we'll discuss now is the idea of samsara. Now, samsara means this cyclical pattern of life, death, and rebirth. It's that reincarnation that you tend to hear quite a bit about when discussing Buddhism or Indian philosophy. Now, samsara has this idea that all the world's constituents, even in the heavenly realms and all that, are impermanent. They don't last forever. And since they're impermanent, they are ultimately dissatisfactory and contain no permanent inner substance to them to make them fully substantial. So the characteristics of samsara and existence in general is one which includes a sense of impermanence, a sense of dissatisfaction, and a sense of non-self. We'll talk about each one of these in more detail. Now, we can assume that since the Buddha had an aversion to discussing matters that did not lead or eventually result in the path to nirvana, that the notion of samsara, or how we understand existence, is important to that path. And so we'll talk about some of these characteristics in more detail. So the first of which is impermanence. As I said before, everything is in constant flux and change. Everything is changing in the world until you are able to reach nirvana. Nirvana is the breaking through and realizing that there is no change in the grand scheme of things. That change is, yes, it's a part of life, but it's also quite an illusion at the same time. So all things in our reality are compounded things that are impermanent, prone to arise and fall. That also includes the realms of the gods. So even the gods are not permanent. They come and they go. They are always, even as a result of their power and their connection to power, subject to dissatisfaction. And because of that dissatisfaction, they are also subject to change. Because things in life change. And there are 3 stages to that change. They arise, they decay, or they can even pass away. So once an object comes into being, it changes over time. I can see that especially true with my young daughter, who seems to continually change and learn and experience new things on a daily basis. Every day that I wake her up in the morning, I notice that she's changed just a little bit. And I realize that over time she'll get older and become an adult. And as she becomes an adult, she'll eventually have kids of her own, hopefully. And then she'll eventually grow old and die. That's a part of life. This is the reality of change. That she will come into existence, and as she comes into existence, she will change throughout her life. And as she changes throughout her life, she will eventually decay and pass away. That's the nature of existence. That's the nature of impermanence. The second characteristic that embodies existence is that of dissatisfaction, which ultimately leads to suffering. So you could say that life is suffering. Kind of a bleak way to look at it. But in reality, that's the way things are. We all suffer. Everything in life suffers. And it's recognizing that suffering which allows us to gain a greater sense of truth and a greater sense of reality. So, dissatisfaction, dukkha, leads to suffering. And suffering is a dissatisfactory condition caused by this axle hole that is not properly made. This is kind of the metaphor that kind of is embodying within Buddhism. That's why a lot of times you see an axle used, or a wheel that's used within the image of Buddhism. So this axle that's been made for our lives is made improperly. Whether it's too big or too small, it causes the axle to wobble or rub in a way that is dissatisfactory to our lives. So either things are not good enough and you want more, or they're too good, and then when they lose their niceness, if you want to call it that, they lose that kind of fresh new feel to it, where you lose that what is nice, what you have, that you enjoy. That also causes dissatisfaction, which causes suffering. So the physical life, such as giving birth, getting sick, growing old, and dying, are all examples of suffering that one experiences because of how the physical world is constituted. Now, sufferings that are associated with changing condition and changing conditions of that physical life also include that idea of suffering as well. So the Buddha did not necessarily deny that happiness exists in life. Yes, people are happy, and you can gain happiness. You can gain happiness either in your family life, or in your community, or the Sangha, or even through meditative attainments. But these enjoyments are subject to change as well. They cannot provide a lasting sense of satisfaction that humanity seeks in life. And since all things are subject to change and all things must pass away eventually, so must all pleasures as well. So as I said before, even though I love my wife and I love my daughter, I do realize that either I will die or they will die, and that death or that loss will cause great suffering. I love them to the nth degree. But because of that love and that deep attachment, if I ever lose them or if I'm ever threatened to lose them, it will cause suffering to me. So humanity in general seeks to find a lasting happiness in things that are impermanent, which cause suffering as well. So people have the feeling that something is missing in their life when they have lost that sense of satisfaction that would otherwise provide lasting happiness. So even if you have something that's good in your life, it will go away, and you'd be missing that sense of happiness in your life. Now, there are also different constituents of one's mind that can generate unwholesome states of mind, such as hatred, anger, greed, and delusion. These also cause a greater sense of suffering. So these qualities can promote a sense of increased suffering in the world. And these unwholesome states of mind which produce suffering, and when acted upon, can cause suffering on oneself, but also to society. This brings to mind one of the famous lines from Star Wars with Master Yoda, when he was talking about suffering leading to the dark side. And he was talking about young Anakin Skywalker and whether or not they should let him in to become a Jedi Knight. Excuse me. And so he says, fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hatred. And hatred leads to suffering. So with that in mind, he's getting to this point that, harmful actions can contribute to the sufferings of war, poverty, and political repression that exists within the world. Just like when Anakin became Darth Vader, spoiler alert, sorry. When Anakin became Darth Vader, he did go through that sense of anger and frustration, which was a result of the loss of his mother and the fear of losing his wife and children, spoiler alert. And that eventually caused that turn to the dark side, which caused great suffering in the Empire. A little Star Wars trivia for you guys. This then brings us to the next characteristic of existence, which is non-self. And this is a particularly Buddhist understanding of the world. Now, in order to talk about non-self, we first need to discuss what self is. And within the Indian philosophies at the time, there was concepts such as Atman, which is this inner permanent self that exists. Now, this inner permanent self is pretty much what makes you you. It's the molecules and the identity that makes you who you are. The exact construct of your body and your mind and your spirit, if you want to call it that makes you who you are. The other concept is Brahman. Brahman is ultimate reality. It's the existence that is a part of all things. It's the web that is connected, or the matrix, if you like to use that term, that connects all humanity and all creation to one another. It's like in the Matrix, like when Neo finally had that moment of clarity, that he realized that when he was in the Matrix, that the Matrix is a part of him and in all things, and he could manipulate it and be a part of it and do all these things in various ways, because he realized that Brahman and the Atman were essentially connected, if not the same thing. So the Atman is that concept of identity, or that permanent self, and Brahman is that ultimate reality that exists. Now there's a division between the self, or Atman, and Brahman that both exists but doesn't exist. It's kind of a difficult concept to grasp, but this is what's known as non-duality. So it's not one, this concept of Atman and Brahman. It's not one, but it's also not two. The way that it was explained to me was the notion of a wave and the ocean. So the wave is this force that exists. It has a certain form, a certain characteristic about it that is unique to its own. No other wave, as most surfers know, there's no wave that is exactly the same over and over again. So there's no two waves that are alike. So a wave has a definite sense of self or identity, a characteristic about it. But then you also have the notion of the ocean. Now, yes, the ocean and the wave are connected, but they're not really the same. So you can't really say that a wave is an ocean, and there's no wave that you can say that an ocean is a wave. So with that in mind, Brahman and Atman are in that same type of relationship. There's no way that the Atman, the wave, can understand what it means to be an ocean. And there's no way that the Brahman or the ocean can be put into the concept of a wave or the Atman. So yes, they are indeed connected. You can't have an ocean without waves, and you can't have waves without an ocean in that sense. But they are also two separate things, two concepts existing in the same reality. So even in the particles that exist within the water, that still make up the wave and the ocean, they are connected, but they are still different characteristics. Now what the Buddha says is that there is no self. This was completely off base from what everyone else was talking about. He's saying that there is no self. There is an anatman. So you have the Atman and then your anatman. And that means that there is no self. That this rejects the idea that there is indeed a permanent self that exists in the world at all. And this in turn rejects the idea that there is a permanent soul as well. So in this sense, it's rejecting the notion that the wave is even a part of reality. That there is no wave. Now, those of you who kind of heard that little line there, similarly explained in The Matrix, when Neo was in that room waiting to see the Oracle, he sees this young boy in front of him, sitting on the ground with a bunch of spoons in his hands. And he's bending these spoons. And Neo is amazed by this. He's saying, "Whoa, that's pretty interesting. How is he doing this stuff?" And the boy turns to him and says, "Do not try to bend the spoon. That would be impossible. Instead, only try to realize the truth." And Neo says, "What truth?" And the boy turns to him and says, "There is no spoon." Whoa. That's kind of that type of understanding there. There is no self. There is no sense of identity that makes me who I am. So that in that sense, I am not necessarily important. What's important, though, is this reality that exists within all creation. So as soon as I let go of my identity, I can then tap into the truth that exists within all creation. So impermanence is not just a characteristic of the external world, but it also applies to oneself. And with the absence of self, that leads to more of a greater understanding of selfless love and an increased compassion for others. This is similar to, a little bit different though, from that phrase that Descartes famously said, cogito ergo sum, that I think therefore I am. This removes the I from that whole notion. So it goes from I think therefore I am to just am. And that is the truth of reality, that we are just there. So once you remove the I from the equation, existence becomes much more expansive and recognizable. And when you do that, you have reached enlightenment. In order for the Buddha to describe the concept of non-self, he first needed to extrapolate further into the notion of what self, or what makes up the idea of self, or Atman. And in order to do that, he described what was known as the 5 aggregates. These are what make up the notion of self, or Atman. And none of these could be considered permanent, according to the Buddha. So the 5 aggregates are in the form, or in the different concepts of form, sensation, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. So in the understanding of form, it talks about how the body is made up of impermanent material elements. These are material elements that are produced by impermanent atoms of different types. So we all kind of vibrate with these atoms that are within our body, and our molecules that are vibrating through us and in us, and make us who we are in the shape that we are. It's what makes my face the way it is, and forms the way that it's perceived that way, or this book the way that it's formed. And I can't really put my finger through it because the atoms in that area are so dense that they are vibrating too quickly and too rapidly for my hand to go through them. But that does not necessarily mean that these atoms are permanently like that. Eventually they too scatter off and decompose, or expand, if you will, which is why things can no longer maintain their integrity, their structural integrities, because the molecules, the atoms that are making up that essence of whatever that is, cease to be maintained. Now, sensations consists of both bodily and emotional sensations. These are categorized as pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral sensations. Then we go into perception. This is the notion of cognition and recognition of physical objects and mental phenomena. These are like ideas and thoughts that we have in our lives. Then we go into mental formation, which include various mental states, certain attitudes and dispositions that form the character of one's life. So these different mental formations bring us into how we perceive the world and recognize the world the way it is. So these include willful states of mind that move us to do certain actions, whether they're good or wholesome or unwholesome actions, which then result in good or bad karma, or wholesome or unwholesome karma. We'll talk a little bit more about karma in the next lecture. And then we get into the layers of the level of consciousness. This includes mental awareness and discrimination. So according to the Upanishadic tradition, the best way and the best candidate to arrive at that idea of the permanent self, or Atman, is through the understanding and recognition of consciousness. So consciousness is the essence of Atman within the traditional understandings of Indian philosophy. This sense of consciousness comes about through various sense faculties that we have. And it includes what you perceive through your eyes, your ears, your nose, tongue, body, and mind. These are all things that were traditionally been attempted to be mastered through the various yogic traditions and techniques. So the various yogis were trying to, or able to, master all these different sense faculties. Now, the Buddha, on the other hand, taught that consciousness only arises when one of the 6 faculties are used, and that these senses are only temporary, and therefore consciousness does not indicate permanent substance. Now, the question I have for you guys is that, do you think this is actually true? Are we only able to experience consciousness through our perceptions? And if so, are our perceptions only temporary? And if they're only temporary, does that make them any less true? What about our concepts of memory? Do they remain constant, or do they fade? Can we trust on our understanding of memory? These are very interesting concepts to really consider. What's interesting is that I just heard a psychologist, a well-known psychologist named Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett, describe how our brain interprets sensations in a way that is very similar to the way that the Buddha described these 5 aggregates. She said in her research that our brain is only able to recognize certain sensations, which are categorized by pleasantness, unpleasantness, arousal, and calmness. And your brain does not know how or what causes them. Now, this is very interesting because it sounds very similar to the way that the Buddha described how we have understandings of pleasantness, unpleasantness, and neutral sensations. Very similar here. And she goes on to say that the brain is able to interpret these sensations and then tries to figure them out by what's causing these 4 sensations based off of past or previous experiences. So given the last time you were in that similar context, what caused that sensation? So if you have this feeling of unpleasantness, or a feeling of wanting in your stomach or whatever, what's causing that? Is it fear, or is it something that's maybe you're looking at someone eating a nice meal in front of you, and that's causing for that sense of either unpleasantness or arousal? That's what's causing that sense of reaction. And this leads to our notion of concepts. So concepts are your brain using past experience in order to make sense of incoming sensory input. So in this sense, emotional concepts are largely based on more of cultural and developmental influences rather than on hardwired emotions that we tend to think of our sense of emotions. We learn to interpret how to express and to react to these sensations based on how others around us are showing us how to do so. This is why some cultures are able to exhibit some expressions of emotions differently than others, or how certain cultures have emotions or sensations that don't exist in other cultures. Kind of an interesting concept here. So these concepts are what shape the raw sensations of pleasant, unpleasant, arousal, and calm into actual emotions that we experience. So the notions of concepts are true even for vision. She explains that if we have no understanding of concepts, if we have no concepts, even in the understanding of how we visually understand things, we will only see bright and dark. We aren't able to see objects. And we know this for a fact. People with corneal damage or cataracts at birth, when they got these conditions repaired later in life, we would have thought that they would have instantly been able to see. But in reality, they don't. It can sometimes take days, weeks, or even years before they're able to see certain objects. And the reason for that is because they don't have an understanding of that concept. They have no past visual experience to make meaning of their visual sensations. So if you put an apple in front of them, they would not be able to see that object. They'd only see light and dark. So emotions and sensations work the exact same way. They're only reactions to how we interpret the world. And our reaction, our interpretation, is then projected and produced based off of those concepts. So we're not really reacting to concepts. We are receiving sensations, and our mind is producing that emotion and projecting it out there. So our concepts make the world that we know it to be. It's only through those concepts that aren't actually potentially even there. It's just our brain creating concepts that makes the world that we know it. Pretty interesting. Very similar to the way the Buddha described this understanding of the five aggregates. That these two are illusions that are produced by the brain. And that these aggregates, this understanding of self, is nothing but an illusion created by our own sense of consciousness and emotional states. Very fascinating. The Buddha also taught that in addition to the five aggregates, we have this notion of dependent arising, which shows how parts interact in ways that generate dukkha as well as the sensation of dukkha. Now this is important. This is the concept that I want you guys to recognize, that is a part of dependent arising. It might come up on a quiz potentially. So that all things arise and pass away due to certain conditions. When necessary conditions are present to support existence, it comes to be. As those conditions change, new conditions appear, and then the thing changes. When the conditions for the thing's existence are finally removed, then the thing ceases to be. This is the notion of dependent arising. I'll go into a little bit more detail about what that actually means here. So, in other words, if the necessary conditions are there for something to exist, then it'll exist. And once it exists, there are things that are, the conditions are there for that to change. But there are also ways to eliminate those conditions. So when those conditions are removed, then that thing can cease to exist. So as you can see this quote here, that being, this comes to be. From the arising of that, this arises. That being absent, this is not. From the cessation of that, this ceases. Now, with that, there are 12 links of conditionality. And he ascribes them, and you can see this kind of in that little circular chart there, is that there are 12 links that connect to each other that provide something for existence. The first is ignorance, and that is the ignorance of the Four Noble Truths. Next you have mental formations. This is ignorance of the conditions that of those mental formations. So while the mind is pure, it can be polluted. And ignorance conditions negative mental formations or unwholesome mental states or attitudes. You then get into consciousness. Mental formations conditions one's consciousness. For example, if one is always angry, then it can be become a part of the disposition of that person and a part of their consciousness. So if one is more negative, then they tend to begin to see only the negative in others. And the opposite can be said. So if one is more positive, you tend to see more of the positive in others. Next you get into mind and body. Mind and body are conditioned by one's consciousness or even health. So your consciousness can affect your sense of mind and or mental and spiritual or physical well-being. I know that's very true for me. If my mind is out of whack, then my body tends to get out of whack too. My back starts hurting if it starts getting stressed out, or my neck starts hurting if I start getting stressed out. The next level here, you start get into the senses. So one's mind and body condition what one perceives through the body. So what you notice versus what you don't notice. This then leads into contact. So sense conditions the contact we have with the world. So if you don't sense it, it can be difficult to physically contact that sensation. But if you do have contact to it, or if you do sense it, then you can have that physical contact. Then that leads into sensation. That's the contact. Then is influenced by the conditions of how one feels mentally or physically towards that contact or that sense. So if you're feeling something, then that feels good, then that's how it works. That leads into craving. So craving either for the desire to continue that sensation or for the cessation of that feeling. So if you feel something that is burning your hand, you're going to crave not to have your hand burning, and you'll remove it. But if you feel something that feels nice, then you'll want to have more of that. You want to feel more of that, so you'll crave more of that. This then leads to attachment. This is an active decision based off of the clinging to the things of this world, the pleasures derived from those things, or an aversion to those things that one does not really enjoy. So you like to move towards things that you like to feel, and move away from things that you don't like to feel. That is a sense of attachment. Now these all then lead into a sense of becoming. So all these dependent conditions then become the formation of one's life. And if you have the formation of one life, this then leads to birth, which is the becoming of life and the creation of birth. And then you finally get, with the creation of birth, that 12th link, which is the whole mass of life, which is essentially suffering, or dukkha. So this birth or identity arises due to the attachments based on ignorance, which continues this whole cycle all over again. So you can see how the cycle moves around, and keeps on coming back into the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. So the Buddha expresses hope in terms of their cessation. So it's not necessarily that this dependent arising is all that negative. You can also complete the fading away of the cessations of these negative conditions based off of your ability to stop these things from happening. So if you are able to become less ignorant and find the truth, then you're able to eventually end dukkha and suffering and then reach enlightenment. You reach nirvana, which is then permanent. You can escape this cycle, this endless cycle, which causes samsara. The expansion of these philosophies can be found within the Abhidharma philosophies. And these Abhidharma schools analyze reality in ways that expanded upon the teachings of the Buddha. So they're not necessarily exactly what the Buddha was discussing in his life, but the concepts that are laid out by the Buddha then expanded upon within these different schools and used in order to provide a greater understanding of the constituents of reality. So that's what they focus on. And these constituents of reality are found within the Dharmas. Now there are different primary elements that make up these understandings of reality. And these are found within material and non-material elements. The material elements are found in the forms of earth, air, fire, and water. So all of you Avatar fans out there, this is where it kind of gets interesting. The Avatar, the last airbender kind of deal. Air, fire, fire and water, that kind of comes into play here. And then the non-material are things that include feelings, perceptions, impulses, and the conscious self. So the first material aspect are looking at the nature of things and the processes of the world, while the second look at the nature and consciousness of its knowledge of the world. So these are the two primary elements that are looked at in the Abhidharma philosophies. Let's first talk about the material elements. Each element, earth, fire, air, and water, contribute to a fundamental quality necessary to explain the existence of matter. So earth, for instance, looks at the notions of solidity and extension. Air looks at the quality of movement. Fire looks at the element of heat and energy. And water looks at the notion of cohesion. So these primary elements are not things like atoms with qualities, but are instead particular instances of solidity, movement, energy, and coherence that merge together in different combinations, producing material entities, and eventually culminate into objects we perceive. So, as this quote says, you should not conclude that difference is to be found in the supporting primary elements. The natures of visible objects are different from each other due to karma, not to any difference in the primary elements. So again, these understandings of the four elements are in essence descriptions of how we understand reality, not necessarily what makes reality. And finally, we come to mental dharmas. These mental dharmas include things such as feelings, perceptions, impulse, and consciousness. And consciousness is a dharma that is always existent within the other dharmas, enabling consciousness of the various mental states that one has. Now, if you look at these different mental states and mental dharmas, you'll find that through reflection, there are good or beneficial categories such as faith, mindfulness, and non-hate. And you also have evil or non-beneficial categories such as conceit, worry, envy, hate, greed, and delusion. But in addition to these two, you also have neutral categories such as will, reflection, and discursive reason. Now, when one meditates, one is able to gain a greater understanding of or reflection on some of the positive and negative attributes that you are building upon in your daily life. So, dharmas that are positive or are negative are important to recognize for mental cultivation. Things that are good should be cultivated. But things that are bad should be identified and then eliminated from one's life in order to provide you with a greater ability to improve yourself. And in doing so, you're eliminating some of these ideas of delusion and hate and greed that can inhibit you from gaining enlightenment. This is what's so important about gaining this sense of reflection and understanding of the mental dharmas.